Good morning, everyone. I can see a few joining today, which is excellent. Hello, I can see Melissa and Asha. Lillian, I think it is. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Chris. I'm joined here together with Rudy, and we're really excited to have you join us this morning. I'm joining you here from the Compono office in Brisbane. Hopefully, we've got some people, I'm sure, from all across the country in different time zones. It's always fun this time of year when you're in Brisbane dealing with the daylight savings time. So that's always good fun. Thanks for joining us today. Really excited, and actually really excited to have you join. And I think you're going to find today really valuable. Actually, we're going to jump into some really interesting areas, interesting territory. So let's get stuck in, and thank you for coming on board on time. So look, if you've been in the space for a little while, like I have, I've probably been in space now for around about 10 years. You know, if you've been in the recruitment and HR space, you understand that hiring is not easy. You know, it's actually quite a challenging thing to do, not only in the time-consuming manual sides of it, but actually dealing with multiple stakeholders. Everyone has a different way of hiring and a different approach to hiring, and you're always managing those things as well. So today's session, we're going to jump into some really interesting territory and talk about one fundamental structural change we recommend you make to your hiring process to make it easier and actually make it a little bit more, well, we think it's a little bit more fun and a little bit more scientific as well. So has anyone here, and you can use the Q&A or the chat if it's available, actually read the Gallup State of the Workforce 2023 report? Maybe just put your hand up or say yes if you have. But we ran through it, and I think it's a really valuable report to read if you haven't read it. I think they surveyed something over 100,000 employees in the workforce, so it's certainly a really strongly statistically valid report. But when you jump in, I think, you know, we'll all understand that every business is a little unique, right? But one fundamental truth still seems to be that people remain the number one challenge for most businesses. And actually, what's quite confronting, to be honest, when you read the Gallup report is just how disengaged the workforce is today. So in fact, 59% of the workforce, on average across the board, is not engaged at work. And even more alarmingly, nearly 1 in 5 are actively disengaged at work. And sadly, only 23% are thriving in the workplace. Now, I look at this and I think, you know, there's something fundamentally wrong here. You know, work's such an important part of our lives. Something is going wrong here where we're not properly connecting people and work together. And what's really interesting when you ask employees, well, what would make the workplace better? 16% say well-being. Only 28% actually go for pay and benefits, which I'm a little bit surprised about, to be honest. But 41% say culture. And in fact, that's the number one thing that people are asking for. Now, what is culture? What does that mean? Let's get under that a little bit more. And that's what today's session is all about. But I'm it's really confronting in some ways to see how disengaged the workforce is and the problem that we're faced as HR and hiring managers. So, look, I think we'd all agree, well, what drives this disengagement? There's a number of factors, of course. But we believe a major, if not the major contributing factor to this disengagement is we're just hiring the wrong people in the first place. So today's session, we're going to explore that a little bit more. How do I avoid hiring the wrong people? And what does that even mean? And so today I'm joined by Rudy Krause, who's with us here. Rudy's a corporate psychologist and is going to bring a wealth of experience and insight into exactly this topic. So I'll hand over to Rudy.
Hey, Chris. Hi, everybody. And thank you for coming along today. So just a little bit of background to myself. So I specialize in culture, competence, and performance. Consulted to a wide range of businesses out there, from government to companies in mining, utilities, and so forth, and anything in between. But personally, my postgraduate research focused on 2 areas. One is disruptive leadership and its effects on organizational outcomes, which is a really interesting topic because most research actually focus on what good leadership looks like. And then the second part of my research is around how culture maturity and organizational culture maturity can predict organization performance. So I think the question here, if you just go back one, Chris, I think the question here is a really interesting one. And I think Chris's point of one of the key contributing factors is we're hiring the wrong people. That's because we're focusing on the top of the funnel, bringing essentially the wrong people into the business that essentially poisons the rest of the well. So when we talk about hiring the wrong people, or the question around what does that actually even mean, of course, no one sets out to hire the wrong person, right? Unless you're obviously, quite detrimental to the organization or destructive to the organization, as it so be. But no one sets out to hire the wrong person. So this scenario or this question really stems out of essentially a concept, which is the candidate that were right on paper, but is wrong in person, right? So they look right on the CV, but is wrong in terms of person fit to the team and the organization and its culture. So had all the right technical skills and the experience and qualifications, but didn't quite fit the DNA of the team and what the team needs and also the company culture. And quite interestingly, a couple of years ago, I think it was in the Australian, or the AFR, I should say, Atlassian wrote an article on this concept called the brilliant jerk. I always refer to it jokingly as, hiring the Sheldon Coopers of the world from Big Bang Theory. If you know Sheldon Cooper, the guy's got all the skills, he's got all the qualifications. I think he's got about 3 PhD, brilliant mind, but nobody wanted to work with him because he was just not a nice person and didn't fit the team and wasn't a team player. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be that extreme in terms of the person's characteristics, but it is an example of, or you can think of an example of someone that just wasn't quite right. Didn't have to be a terrible person, but they just didn't fit. And the reason why we ended up hiring the candidate that looks right but potentially is wrong is because most hiring still essentially happens within a vacuum. The old, outdated, traditional approach of posting a job to a job board and hiring based on what's written on a CV and essentially hoping that they fit our team and our business, not essentially finding out if they're a good fit until they're in the company. And then for me, this is what I've experienced too, is this is further echoed by the old beer test interview, right? This is, will this person, or can I have a beer with this person at the end of the day? If so, you're hired. If not, well, beat it. You're out. So it's highly subjective in that sense. And we kind of internally call it the outside in model versus the inside out model. So outside in is basically looking at the CV, hoping that they're going to fit inside of the organization, compared to the inside out, which we'll talk about a little bit more today, which is understanding the team needs, what they're good at, what they're not so good at, and essentially complementing the team to become high performing more holistically. So I've seen this is a long-winded way of saying, why did we end up, or why are we still in this scenario where most people are actively disengaged or disengaged in their job, and so few people that are actually enjoying what they're doing and the organizations that they're in. So maybe, Chris, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about an example where this came to life. So in my journeys over the years, consulted, like I said, to many companies. One was a mining company out in central Queensland. The safety department had a huge issue. But when I turned up, they were all pleasant, nice people. They gelled really well. They got along really well with each other. And they would just seem to be, on a surface level, quite close and seem to be quite capable of doing the job. However, scratching away at it, it seemed a little bit like they weren't meeting their stakeholders' expectations. So if you know anything about a mining department, they're essentially a shared service across the organization. And so what we did was, with this mining department, was to understand how they work, what their gaps were, and essentially look at opportunities or ways that they could hire the right person that could fit within their team. So maybe, Chris, if you can move on to the next slide. So apart from just being nice people, when we looked at how they actually worked, they were great at delivering work. They were great at delivering documentation, policies and procedures, and they delivered it on time, right? They had high quality documents. Nobody questioned their documents, and they were exceptionally good at auditing. They were great at doing things, great at evaluating the organization, and essentially punching out work. However, when you scratched away at the surface and started looking at what some of their customers or stakeholders were saying, yes, they were doing a lot of work. Yes, they were on time, but what they were doing wasn't necessarily what the rest of the business needed. So it's a case of doing great work or doing a lot of work and on time, but not necessarily the right kind of work. So what this essentially led to is, because they were writing so many audits, policies, procedures, they were typically stuck behind the computer. They weren't out there engaging with their stakeholders, with the rest of the crews, the operational teams, and so forth. So, and this is not an uncommon characteristic when you're in heavy industry. They just didn't trust the safety team because they didn't feel the safety team listened. They didn't feel that the safety department had their best interest at heart, and they were just basically writing policies and procedures. So what ended up happening was crews and the rest of the business were really just ignoring them. And that was basically because, well, they didn't feel they had the bigger picture. Now, if you think about it, if your safety department and the rest of the business don't connect and people are ignoring policies and procedures, well, catastrophe can happen, right? This is where people die. So in terms of what the rest of the business said, well, they were essentially a terrible service to the rest of the business. Didn't quite hit the mark. So if you move on to the next slide then here, Chris. So this is where we then stepped into the next phase. Okay, so we understand what they were good at. We understood what they weren't so good at. And then what I did was we overlaid this information with essentially some academic modeling and academic research. Now, based on academic research, it defines what all high-performing teams do really well. So there's essentially 8 key types of work every high-performing team provides coverage to and essentially do well. So this is from evaluating, coordinating, doing, auditing, down to essentially campaigning. So if I go very quickly through those 8 key types of work. So evaluating is the ability to weigh up options, the ability to understand information, compare and contrast, risk assess information, and to choose the best alternative. Once that best alternative is chosen, then what a team really needs to be able to do is to coordinate. So this is where you then divvy up work, you make a plan, set timelines, and essentially make sure the right work gets done. Once you've got that plan, once you've able to coordinate work, it then comes down to doing, right? So this is actioning your plan. So this is essentially where you get down and dirty, your hands dirty, and just get the work done. Once you get the work done, of course, you've got to audit your work, right? You've got to evaluate that what you've done is actually a good piece of work. And you have to then be very focused, as it says there, let's focus on the details where you can understand, have you done essentially what you set out to achieve and based on your plan. Once you've audited your work, you're then going to maintain your work, right? So as a team, you have to maintain your systems, your policies, your procedures to make sure that it's continuously happening. And then, of course, the next part of being in a team and high performing is you've got to be able to advise, right? So this is where you work with your stakeholders, and in this case, the rest of the crews and the rest of the business, where they would go and investigate a problem. And based on investigating a problem and understanding the needs of a problem, you would then pioneer, right? You would then potentially come up with new ideas or essentially switch back to evaluating where you compare and contrast your existing systems and processes, but you're looking for ways to improve what you're doing on. And once you've got that idea, you can then move to campaigning, which is essentially comes back to being able to sell the dream, whether that's sell yourself, sell your service, or whatever the case may be. Now, I could have started anywhere on this wheel, but the story is still the same, right? You've got to be able to coordinate. You've got to be able to evaluate what you're doing, to maintain what you're doing, to advise essentially your stakeholders, to come up with new ideas, and then to sell yourself and sell your service. So these are the 8 key types of work that every high-performing team needs to provide coverage for. Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean you need 8 key different types of people, which I'll get to in a second. You as a team just need to make sure that you're set up to be able to deliver those 8 key types of work. Now, this is where it becomes a little bit more complex, right? Because if you match human behavior and behavioral characteristics, and more specifically personality, with high-performing team theory, what it essentially says is, based on our personality and behavioral characteristics, we prefer certain types of work over other types of work. It's essentially what we call the 4 Ps, and that is the type of work you perform, you get pleasure out of it, become more proficient, and essentially you want to do that different types of work. So if you can move to the next slide, Chris. So really what this is around is mapping personality theory with high-performing team theory. And as I said, because of your personality, you've got certain preferences for performing certain types of work, which means that some key types of work will get more preference or more pleasure and more proficiency at the end of the day than other types of work. So it's like, let's use an example, right? You've got the choice of playing tennis versus soccer. Now, I really prefer tennis over soccer. So guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to look for every opportunity to practice my forehand, practice my serve, practice my backhand. As I practice it more, I get more pleasure out of it and I become more proficient at it. What happens on the other side is my soccer skills don't necessarily evolve and I don't get a lot of pleasure out of it because I don't get better at it, right? People tend to like things they get better at. So this was definitely the case for the safety department. When we looked at their personality mapped back onto this high-performing team structure and task structure, what we found was this team was distributed across those 3 work areas, which is doing. As I said at the start, they were great at doing. They were great at auditing, right? So evaluating their work, writing good documents, policies and procedures. What they weren't so good at is that helping, advising, pioneering, campaigning aspect. So they weren't that great at getting outside, meeting the crews, understanding their needs, advising them, coming up with new ways that actually suits that organization and that crew, and therefore become better salespeople of their own team. Now, luckily, in the scenario was they did look to grow the team. So this is where this information became highly valuable for us, because what we were able to do was to say, okay, you're really good at doing and auditing and evaluating and some overlap with coordinating, right? But on the other side, you weren't good at that whole engagement piece. So what we were able to do is to identify the behavioral characteristics that we needed in the next team member. And that's essentially what we did. We set out to find a person that had the right skills in qualifications in safety, had experience in mining, had the right knowledge in terms of legislation in mining, but we also needed someone that wanted to be out there, wanted to engage with the teams and the crews and the rest of the business to bring back that information to the rest of the doers, the auditors, and the evaluators. This person essentially then became the face of the safety department. And they liked it, right? They wanted to do it. They wanted to do more of it compared to the people that were stuck in doing. Well, they did not want to go out and meet people, right? So, hey, listen, let's not force people to necessarily do everything that they don't want to do. Yes, we've got to be able to flex, and yes, based on our personality, we can flex, right? So based on our personality, you know, the way I act at work versus the way I act at home versus the way I act in front of my mother-in-law, you know, is quite different. So therefore, I can adapt and change my behavior, but I have a certain preference for behaving, and under pressure and under stress, my natural behavior and natural tendencies come out. So in this scenario, under pressure, under stress, the majority of the team wanted to audit, wanted to do. So we wanted to get someone that could fill that gap. And that's essentially what we were able to do. And this is what today's session is about, is to understand what you can do to actually evaluate what your team needs, right? So this is that concept of the inside out model. first understanding your team, first understanding their strengths and their challenges, and then understanding what you need to do to provide a more holistic overlap of each of those 8 key types of work. Once you can get an understanding of that, you can kick off the recruitment process. You can go and do the old traditional process, which is post your job to a job board, you get your CV in, you understand skills and qualifications, but you can use that information to then drive the right interview questions, moving away from the old beer test of, is Susie or is Dave the kind of person I want to hang out with, and subjectively, give them the job and make that top of the funnel error, which is, hire the wrong person, to essentially move it to a more scientific, strategic approach to who you need to bring into your teams. So now the next question is how? So this is where we've developed for you guys a very practical tool, very easy for you to ask yourself or your team, based on your team, 4 simple questions. And based on these simple questions, you'll be able to use recommended or some key interview questions with a scoring key that you can interview your candidates with. So I'm going to throw over to Chris to just jump through some of what that looks like.
Thanks, Rudy. That was great. Yeah, so look, the team's really excited, actually. We recognize that majority of the people I believe on the webinar today are not currently Compono customers. So the Compono platform has been designed to do what I'm about to show you at a lot more depth and a lot more scale for open roles. So it does automatically assess candidates at both the culture level. So if they're a match for your culture, a match for the team and what you need from a candidate to join your team, and also for job fit as well. But we recognize most of you won't have access to the platform at the moment. So the team sat down a couple of weeks ago. We thought, what can we do to make sure everyone walks away today with some value and a tool they can use right now for the existing roles you're hiring for, either right now or the ones you've got coming up. And so what we've done is we've gone and built a tool, as Rudy just mentioned. So let me quickly show it to you now. We'll be sharing this with you after the webinar. And as I go along here, just let me know if you do have any questions. So there is a chat, I believe, Nathan. It's either chat or Q&A. So feel free to ask any questions or any comments you might have as I go through this. So we'll be sharing this out after the webinar has concluded today and after we've gone through our Q&A at the end to help you better assess candidates and do some of what we just covered, which is that team assessment piece first. So what we've done is I'll just go you through here. We built this tool. It's quite simple, and I'll show you how it works. You simply come in here, press start now, and then we go through here. And all it is, as Rudy mentioned, is 4 questions. So I want you to just stop and think about your current teams, your current work environment, maybe the open role you might have at the moment, and the team that candidate you're about to hire is going to be joining, and use this as a tool just to take a different lens on assessing candidates for that role. So what we're going to go through here is a team assessment. I want to make that clear. It's not a candidate assessment, it's a team assessment. So think about the team and then choose A or B in terms of these options. Your team requires the new team member, the candidate you're assessing, to have a stronger preference for which of these options. So as we go through, it's quite simple. As you can see here, this is all free, of course, to use. Come through here, you answer the question, thinking about what your team, what you need from a candidate, what preference, what work styles you need from a new candidate coming through. And
just before you finalize that, can we just go back to the survey part?
Yep. Back into the questions?
Yeah, please.
I might just need a second to do that.
No worries. So I think just pausing there for a minute. So what makes this questions relevant? Well, it's based on Jungian theory, personality theory. Of course, this is not a holistic personality or team assessment. It's essentially a shortened version that looks at essentially, so if we go with the first one, right, does your team need someone that is highly collaborative, highly expressive, interactive, talking, group environment, or do you need someone that is going to be able to work independently in a quiet work environment and essentially work by themselves? So depending on what your team needs, you can click on the right dichotomy or the right version, right? Yeah, great. The next one essentially asks the question, what does your team need in terms of information, right? Is it very factual, concrete, detailed oriented information that you need from team members or the new hire? Or is it more strategic thinking, right? Is it long-term vision that you need to bring into the team? Or is it more that concrete detail? So depending on what your team needs, you would select the right version. The third part then asks around how the team, or how do you want decisions to be made from the new hire? Someone that is quite rational and objective versus essentially someone that brings team members or brings stakeholders along the journey, really considering their feelings, really considering the norms, and essentially being more people oriented. So is it more cold, factual decision making, or more inclusive type of decision making? And then the final piece is around, do you need someone that is quite structured in the way they work, structured in the sense of making plans and making sure that deadlines are met? Or do you need someone that can be quite free-flowing in terms of flexibility, not so much worried about timelines, but more around exploring new opportunities? So it's about the journey, not the outcome, right? Or the destination, whereas the previous one, it's about the destination, not the journey. So you might say, well, really, most work will want people to work to deadlines and to plans. Well, think about someone that's quite creative. That might not necessarily be the case, right? So depending on what your team needs and what your team needs to deliver, you can answer those 4 questions, and essentially, Chris, you can take over from
Yeah,
there.
sure. No, thanks, Freddie. And thanks for the more detailed explanation too. I think that really helps. So if we just tie this back to the 8 work actions and the work personality wheel that we were looking at before, based on the answers that you provide to these 4 questions, you will then be mapped and tracked to one of those 8 work personality types. And so as you go through, I'll just show an example. Depending on how you answer, then we tell you the kind of candidate you're looking for based on the team assessment. So based on, this is one of those 8, of course. In this scenario, you've come up with a campaigner. So the major characteristics of the campaigner are listed here, so you get some description of the kind of candidate you're looking for. But that's all well and good. But now you've actually got to go find them, right? And so that's why we've added to this a couple of extra bits of data here. First is 3 specific questions based on the kind of work personality and the kind of candidate your team requires, so that when you go in and interview, you can use these 3 questions to sort and assess candidates and to see who is more aligned to the kind of candidate that your team requires. And then in addition to that, we've also got here a scoring key. So as you click on here, you can go in and use this to actually assess and score the responses each candidate gives to those 3 questions, because we also recognize it's easy to, like, when you're 3 or 4 interviews in, you've forgotten, sometimes what was discussed in the first interview. So it's a good way to track and be more scientific and more have a proper framework, I suppose, for going through that interview process. Anything you want to add to that, Rudy?
Yeah, I think, at the end of the day, you're still going to be asking your technical questions and your experience and qualifications type questions. But this specifically, what this tool does is it allows you to ask more pointed and structured questions around the behaviors that you're looking for. So it moves that whole conversation away from the be a test. Look, I can tell you right now, I'm yet to find an organization that doesn't do an interview. Now, just because you're doing an interview doesn't mean you're good at it. I've seen organizations that basically just have a yarn and, completely biased, completely unstructured, and that whole peer test mentality to organizations that are completely structured and have scoring keys and so forth. And that is really what we're trying to do here, is to bring more structure into asking more of these essential skills type questions, right? I don't like calling them soft skills because I actually think they're hard skills personally, but we refer to them as essential skills. So not a lot of people know how to ask essential skill interview questions or which one to ask. And this is essentially what we're enabling you to do through a very simple tool. Now, of course, if you wanted the more holistic personality and team assessment, well, you have to talk to Compono for the more validated assessment, but this is a bite-sized, easy to use couple of questions that can help guide you a little bit more. Now, I did see there's a Q&A question there, which is, what diversity considerations have you taken? I think this is a really great question, right? Because most hiring managers, most teams hire for the same type of person over and over again, which ends up they're hiring the same type of people, right? And so when you think about diversity, there's a lot of groupthink and a lot of hand clapping and hand holding and harmony with hiring the same type of person. But the downside of that is it doesn't bring in a lot of diversity of thought. And this is essentially what this tool allows us to do, is to understand where your team is likely to have harmony and potential groupthink depending on their strengths. And then also to go, okay, what other diversity of thought do we need to bring in from a behavioral perspective? So this is a very unique way to actually think about diversity. So yes, it might not talk about diversity in terms of gender and race and religion and age, but it's truly what makes teams quite different and high performing is that diversity of thought in types of work preferences that individuals have.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like we've kicked off the Q&A already, which is excellent. So I was just going to do a quick wrap and say the tool I just showed you will make available to everyone after the webinar, and to be able to go in that and use that for really any of the roles that you have live at the moment, you're hiring for at the moment, or anything you've got coming up. So hopefully you get a lot of value from that. Thank you from, it's anonymous attendee for that great question. So let's kick off, because I can see we've got a few people here, and look, having a corporate psychologist on the line for another 5 or 10 minutes, I'd certainly encourage you to take advantage of that. You won't have to pay the $1,000 an hour that often comes along with that time. So I can see Marcella and Melissa and Tracy, Wesley, Vanessa. If you've got any questions for Rudy, now's the time. Just type them into the Q&A and we'd be happy to cover that off. I think we've had another question come through there, Rudy. I'm not sure if you can see that, or I can read it out for you. It might be from the same person. Yeah.
Yeah. What if I have a large team that is well balanced? How do I decide what I'm looking for? So this is actually I love this question too, because before I dive directly into your question, now I know a lot of times people say to me, okay, well, based on my personality, I've got a preference for each of those individual work tasks or high-performing work tasks. Do I need 8 people in a team? Well, no, you don't need 8 people in a team. But what you need is to actually understand, well, am I hiring? Or do I have the budget to hire and bring the right person in? Great. If I do, well, then I need to understand, where my team's strengths and weaknesses are. Or alternatively, which is addressing your question a little bit more, do I have the right systems and processes in place to enable coverage of each of those 8 key types of work? So this is where you as a manager need to make sure that you enable the team through systems, through processes, through ways of work to provide coverage for each of those 8 key types of work. So this will also create some diversity of thinking. Yes, it might actually create a bit of conflict, but conflict is good too, right? If managed correctly. So through your systems, through your processes, through your procedures, this is where you're going to have to make sure you spend time in each of those 8 key types of work and enable the team to spend time across them, rather than just say, okay, well, we've got, good coverage and you guys should work it out by yourselves. That's not really how this is going to go, right? This is where you as the manager, with your own preference and your own biases, need to make sure you provide the guardrails to provide coverage to each of those.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rudy. We've got another, I was chuckling when I saw this question. Can you see the new question coming in, or I can read it out? I think hopefully everyone online can read the Q&A. So another great question.
Yeah. So if we hired Sheldon, what could we do? So listen, I think this is an interesting one, because it's also an emotional laden question as far as I'm concerned, right? Because yes, you want to obviously support and steer the individual, and sometimes that is exactly what you can do. And actually, I'll give an example from an employee I've had before, right? They were very much into the auditing space, and the work we ended up giving this individual was very much auditing related. So we kind of carved out and identified activities where this person's going to excel at. right? And so they were happier in the workplace. The other team members were happier because, this person all of a sudden had a spark and, worked well together. However, if it's also a person that is just a difficult person that has got nothing to do with work preferences, well, this is where that emotional laden piece comes in, which is you're going to have to make the uncomfortable decision to move them on, right? Because one bad apple can spoil the rest of the batch, right? So sometimes that is just what needs to happen, and you need to move them on fairly quickly. But if it's about the type of work that you can give them, that is fantastic, right? So like I said, in this example, this person wanted to be a technical expert. So we enabled this person to do that. But if they're still difficult at that point, yeah, this is where you're going to have different performance management discussions.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rudy. Just anyone who would like to ask a question, just type it into the Q&A box. Hopefully you've got access to that. It'd be great to have a couple more questions at least. Just one while we're waiting, because I know it's one that we've heard a few times in the past as well, which is a natural thing, right? If we start to implement this change and we start to do this team assessment, Rudy, how would you recommend people then, fast forward 12 months, how should they track the impact that that's having on the performance of the team?
Yeah, I actually really like that question too, because I'd say very few organizations evaluate the team other than, their basic, how many widgets do they make, right? So this is where I would kind of approach it from a maturity model perspective. So if you think about maturity models, they typically range from 1 to 5. So highly immature to highly generative or highly mature. And what you would do is you would evaluate the team on each of those 8 key types of work, right? So how good are we at doing from 1 to 5? How mature are we at advising 1 to 5? How mature are we at campaigning? The beauty of doing it that way is you can create a benchmark and evaluate the progress of the team over time. The other advantage of doing that is essentially to say, you can do a self-assessment. So the team rates themselves and the manager rates the team, but you can also get your stakeholders to rate you as well. How good are we, in your opinion, at engaging with you, doing good quality work, meeting deadlines, right? So that maturity model can really highlight the hot spots for your team and where you might need to provide coverage.
Wonderful. Are there any other questions? I'll just wait a couple more seconds to see if anyone else had any other questions. Rudy or
so Chris, just on that. So I think that 8 key types of work and the personality actually extends beyond just recruitment and looking where what you need to bring into the team. I think it can become a key performance review tool as well for the team and identify initiatives that you need to implement over the next 12 months to build the capability and maturity in the team. So, I think these tools are quite multifaceted, I guess.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rudy. No other questions have come in, so hopefully everyone has enjoyed the session. Thanks everyone for the participation. We really appreciate it. If you were interested in looking at the component platform, we do all of what we've covered today and a lot more automated and at scale for all your roles. And I think, as Rudy mentioned too, sure, there's a focus here on the hiring process, but it's really much more than that. This is actually about business performance optimization, higher team performance, and creating higher performing teams overall, and the productivity and engagement impact, which is where we started, right? That can have on your business overall. So hopefully you've gained some value. We'll be sure to share a link to the recording for this session and also for the tool that I shared before, so you can start using that straight away. So thanks so much, everyone, for taking the time. We really appreciate it.